Welcome back, Quaggin lovers. We're going to talk about our first map, Edge of the Mist, or otherwise known as EOTM. So following what we laid out in our introduction, we'll start with step 1, the type of immersion. Basically, the art is trying to either show narrative or show gameplay, and more than likely we will be somewhere in between with our map designs. So let's get into it and add some more layers of complexity here. And there's this other layer here where you see quality, low, and high. And we're going to analyze each little art element that's applicable to map design. Super cool. So I think color is a good enough place to start. If you zoom all the way out, you can obviously see they broke down the territories in 3 kind of different colors. From just there, mechanically, they're already breaking up the territories into each team. So you have the red over here, blues in the snow, and greens in the forest. The next level that you can actually look at is the value of our colors. So even now, you can actually sort of see where the snow is actually a bright spot. In the bottom left, it's a little bit of a mid-tone gray, and for the forest, it's actually a darker shade of gray as well. It might not show up in the video due to compression, but you'll just have to take my word for it, and we'll go by the honor system on this. Fabulous, that's great. So how exactly does that translate to our little graph earlier? Well, pretty simple. So we just said color broke down territories, and that's definitely a mechanical thing or gameplay. But we also have to acknowledge this is Edge of the Mist. So essentially we're merging 3 or so worlds together, which is a narrative feature. And the colors, of course, do that in the center and where they overlap. The next thing we need to acknowledge is the actual team colors down here. So we have blue, green, and red. So if I was just to subjectively draw a curve on our little graph here, we would be having most of our quality or quantity in the center, and there would be a little bump for gameplay. And that's basically the team colors right there. All right, super. What's the next element? Well, let's talk about shapes. So I'll bring up my little graph here. So big picture stuff. Obviously, we see that the whole map is a triangle, which makes sense because, it's 1v1v1. But for narrative speaking, all of our little islands or fragments are organic. The interesting is the small little shapes for objectives. They're inorganic, so they're like circles. For green, it seems. For blue, it has a bunch of boxes. And for red, their whole fort is one big triangle. I would have liked to seen actually more triangles on red's side. It would have made more sense. So if we go back to our graph for shape, it'd be kind of a bell curve, but maybe a little bit more over to the gameplay, because we are definitely showing our smaller shapes, differentiating each little team. However, our larger organic shapes are still for the narrative focused. That's fabulous, just great. So our next element we'll be looking at, hopefully our last element, is line. What I mean by this is basically the pathways that art is guiding the player down. So if the pathways are long, continuous, confident, uninterrupted, then they would be more about game mechanics than they would be narrative. Now for EOTM, you can see that there's a lot of small lines that interconnect the islands, just sort of organically, so it makes me believe that it's more narrative focused. Furthermore, there's actually imbalance in these pathways. You can see from these 3 towers that there's roughly 3 straight lines, but green here with the statuary has an extra pathway you can go to in order to get to the juncture in here in the middle, which is an interesting little thing, but that might be kind of imbalanced. So stepping back, if we were to graph this out, I would say the line graph is going to look more like this, and the quality is kind of low for the other side. If you're feeling a little lost, don't worry. Here's the big picture. I combined those 3 elements into one small graph. So if we just kind of visually average these out, what you actually see is what I think we want for our art. And that's the in-between. Now I say we want the in-between because of the camera. So why am I talking about camera suddenly? Well, usually first-person games, they have higher texture fidelity, so you can actually get up close and see something interesting besides just moss. What this does is it kind of tells a story. I mean, the story for this particular object is very boring. It's saying that it's slightly overgrown, which makes sense since we're on the overgrowth side of Edge of the Mist. Now, you don't actually want to play World vs. World like this. If you aren't zoomed out, you'd probably be dying on ink. Which is why I say the little bell curve is best in the center of our spectrum. Because we don't need to put so much emphasis on telling narrative storying as, say, first-person game modes might. However, we don't need super high contrast where we see only mechanics, like, say, I don't know, a chess game, where the camera is actually either a god's eye view or it's really far back. Moving on to step 2, map mechanics, and boy, this is going to be painful. So, I think the only way I can make my point is to actually list out the mechanics on this map, because that's the real issue here. Alright, so very quickly, you got your keep, you got your tower, you got a supply generator, and then you have your sentry, the altar, where you can turn into a mist form basically and be immortal for a couple minutes. At the observatory, purchase sentry turrets to mark enemies. The statuary apparently has a couple of super cannons for defense. The shrine can summon a powerful coda if you step on some pressure plates. The bell tower allows you to summon NPCs. The forge will give you some damage reduction. The worm tunnel allows you to travel across the map. The airport, you can purchase airstrike grenades. At the workshop, you can transform into a siege devourer that fires fireballs. And I think that's about it, really. Just let me know in the comments if I missed any. Otherwise, let's move on. So why am I harping on this? Well, it is simple psychology, mainly with memory. You can only really keep track of about 7 things plus or minus 2, and that's just for simple tones and digits. If you're throwing away all these unique mechanics, you're not only unbalancing the map, you're also forcing the player to remember more and more and more, but not necessarily add any depth to it, just complexity. So that's one of the downsides. The next downside, mechanically, is the large, vast potholes. But I've also heard a defense for this map when it comes to such things, that it's an overflow map, that it's a test map, and it all doesn't matter. But honestly, that's the real crime here, that it doesn't matter. Before I get too mopey, let's move on to step 3, Sightlines. Alright, so what does EOTM look like? So our first sightline is just the spawn one, and in the distance we can see the tutorial. I'm okay with that. It would have been nice to maybe have the tutorial close by and we get a nice little framed shot of a keep or something, but this will work. So moving on from that. So what was I drawn to for the sightlines? Mainly the towers. They're obviously the tallest thing on the map. Next were some of the beacons for only some of the places. One issue I had was the workshop underground near Red Keep. That didn't totally stick out to me as well. Next are kind of keeps themselves. It was actually annoying when an enemy has your spawn keep because the outer wall, you can't actually go through the portals. Plus, the shapes themselves aren't necessarily as recognizable as a keep, where the other maps, it's like an inner and outer, and they're whole one unit for the keep. However, in this one, they're sort of spread out across the whole area as the whole keep. So there are a few objects that were drawing my attention, but they weren't actually meaningful. So for one, there's these red banners by this tower that was actually owned by Green. Another instance was just this mountain that I thought was going to lead up to some objective, but it didn't. Lastly, the red ship in the middle. Well, I'll let the clip speak for itself. I see a blimp for something. So we can't do anything with this ship. Fascinating, truly, but yeah. Well, just use the minimap. but that's the whole point of the sightlines. You're trying to minimize your use of looking at the mini-map. So that's why I'm actually talking about sightlines in this sense. I want to make it intuitive as possible to get from point A to point B or and then C. Woot! Finally, the conclusion. Probably sounded mopey through the entire thing, but for good reason. To be honest, this is a delightful disappointment. The art was actually amazing. It actually conveyed a sense that it was in the mist. It was in this new dimension. Fragments of other little dimensions coming together. But then all that's mired down by the oversaturation of game mechanics, long distances between objects, and of course the enormous potholes. Hopefully we all learned something from this. And if you think I missed anything or I screwed up or things should be longer, shorter, please feel free to leave a comment below. Subscribe if you want to hear more for the next few maps. Like if you liked it, dislike if you disliked it. I will see you next time.